Hey, friends. Thanks for joining me again. We're here to talk about the very last part of your theory of change. That is identifying your inputs and assumptions. And finally, testing this whole thing, making sure that it's landing, making sure that it feels coherent. So we work on these couple of aspects because it's really helpful in your theory of change to identify your organization's unique assets. What are the things that your team brings to bear on the problem and the solution you're working on that nobody else can? Those are your inputs. It can really help you identify what is special about your organization, what's special about your team. And then identifying assumptions is a practice in intellectual honesty. It allows you to think, what are the things that are within our control that we might be able to mitigate in terms of risks? What are some of the things that we're assuming and we feel we are justified in assuming because they are a value of our organization? Every organization makes some assumptions about how change happens, and it's helpful for you to just be honest about those things. These are the two pieces we'll be talking about today. So let's dive in and help you figure out exactly how you define inputs and assumptions for your own team. Inputs are really the resources that your organization needs. So sometimes folks will describe these as resources or assets. As with the other parts of your theory of change, you can use different language depending on what you feel like is most appropriate as long as the concept is there. Inputs are really the assets and resources that you bring to bear, and they'll include the following kinds of things. So, financial resources, people resources, which could include staff or volunteers. Expertise is another big one. Any technology systems that you've developed that are a real differentiator for you, data that you might have access to that other organizations don't. And the final one is a big one, intangibles. So, every organization might have something that is perceived about them, brand positioning, community trust, that is a really helpful asset and positions them to do their work in a unique way that other organizations aren't. So, for example, Objective Zero, the organization that we've been using throughout this as an example, their inputs were funding, which is critical to do everything. Staff, they have a rather small staff. Technology was a big one for them. As a mobile app, they need to make sure that they have the front end of their mobile app as well as the back end database to power this whole thing, and then analytic tools to understand where people are going, how people are using the app. So the technology for them was a very important differentiator compared to a lot of other veteran serving organizations. They rely quite a bit on volunteers. As I mentioned before, their whole model relies on connecting people in the military community who are looking for peer support with peers who understand their position, who have been there. So they need to be really strong at recruiting volunteers from the military community to support other veterans. Finally, they relied on two different kinds of partners. And so they broke these out. They have resource partners that provide different resources that they list on the app. Folks that will provide, concrete support, other places to turn, in addition to job training, in addition to local events, and a variety of other resources. They have a long list of resource partners, and they have a much shorter list of training partners. They actually have one organization that they work with that helps train all of their volunteers. So that partner was really critical for them. And without that partner, they couldn't do their work as well. These are the top inputs that they opted to put in your theory of change. Your theory of change will, of course, be different, but it's helpful to think about how simple can you make this while still expressing some of the really critical assets that your organization needs to do your work. Now let's talk about assumptions. Assumptions are really the beliefs and worldviews that you have about how change happens as an organization. You can sometimes express these as beliefs. There will tend to be some overlap with your organization's values in here. Really, it's helpful to define this at the end of your theory of change process because you want to look at this whole theory, the connection between all of your inputs to activities, to long-term outcomes, to ultimate impact. Look at that whole thing and ask, what are assumptions are we making about how change happens here? And just be honest about that. If you're having a hard time really getting into that question, one way to break it down is to ask, okay, well, what in the world needs to stay constant in order for this change we've outlined in our theory of change to happen? Some of those things will be in your control. Some of those things are out of your control. But if you name them, you can at least start mitigating risks. So things within your control, this could include flexibility in how you use your resources, the quality of your work, the levels of staffing, the technology tools you use, things that are part of your organization's infrastructure that need to be in place in order for your vision of change to happen. Contrast this with things outside of your control. So there are things like the political climate, the economy, government policies, changes in the nature of the problem in general, partner priorities, demographic shifts, other organizations that are competing with you, all of these external things that might influence how you actually are able to make change happen. And we're often assuming that these things are staying rather constant so that the work that we do continues to be viable in the future. You don't have to list every potential other thing that you need to stay constant, but maybe think about like, what are some of the really big shifts that we could honestly see happening that could be really threatening to our ability to make change? For example, let's say the local city government or local state government is actually considering launching a competing program that does the same kind of work that your organization does. That could make a really significant difference if you name that thing as one of your top potential things that needs to stay constant, one of the top potential assumptions. You can start thinking about, how do we mitigate this risk? How might we get in front of that to understand if that's going to happen? Okay, so let's examine this from the perspective of Objective Zero. One of their biggest assumptions was just that their technology works. And they're a technology company. They spend a lot of time trying to make sure that everything is up and running as intended, but they've been burned by this in the past. They ran their app for a number of months at one point with a critical flaw that kicked people out of it as soon as they got on. They were wondering, why isn't anybody really engaging with this? And they learned that they need to have better systems for monitoring how well their technology is working in real time and addressing any of those issues with their developers as soon as possible. So that's one example of an assumption. Some of the other ones that came up for them, they are assuming that their volunteers want to engage on an ongoing basis because it's all sort of predicated on a meaningful peer relationship. Well, you can't have a peer relationship if a volunteer pieces out after 2 days. They were also assuming that folks will use their app before they're in a crisis situation. Somebody actually realizes, yeah, I need more social connections, more people that get where I'm coming from and I can talk to about some of my challenges before it gets to a point where they actually need to see a licensed professional or a therapist. There's a certain level of need that a professional can address much better than a volunteer can. Objective Zero is assuming they can meet folks at the point where a volunteer can still be helpful. They're assuming that their volunteers follow their training. They're assuming that peer support in general works, and they've got a lot of research, a lot of evidence to back this up. But it's still something that has yet to be proven out for the veteran community specifically. They assume that if folks know about resources, they will eventually maybe use some of those resources. And we all know that there are a number of other barriers that prevent that from happening all of the time. But finally, they're also assuming that these resources are helpful, that resources designed specifically for the military community are actually effective for the military community. These were some of the things that came up as important to them. Again, your organization will come up with different assumptions, but it's helpful to be honest about these things, because if you can say, hey, these are the top 7 assumptions we have, then you can create a plan for figuring out, how do we mitigate the risk if one of these assumptions goes sideways? Okay, so we've talked about the last couple aspects of your theory of change. Really, you've covered all of your bases. So it's time now for you to test your theory of change. Before you call this thing done, I would highly encourage you to share it with just a few people and ask for their feedback. I always encourage folks to ask some folks who are friendly to your organization first. So somebody who knows your issue, somebody you've got a strong relationship with, could include some board members who haven't been a part of this process, maybe a funding partner, maybe a highly engaged volunteer or program participant, maybe somebody at a peer organization. Share with them the visual version and the narrative version that you've come up with so far, and then ask them to answer the following questions. First, is this thing clear as we've expressed it? Second, is this thing plausible? Or are there some components that seem like they're missing in order for us to create the change we're seeking? And then the third is this thing authentic? Does it express what we do well? Does it align with our values as an organization? That's a good starting place. You'll probably have some other questions that have come up for you in this process you can get feedback on, but start there and definitely consider their feedback. ask a handful of friendlies, get their input, and then you don't have to take every suggestion they have, but definitely give it some weight because they know and care about your organization. And then you can call this thing done. As a reminder, I've got the self-grading rubric. You'll have a link to access this and use this as a checklist to make sure, hey, we've done what we really need to do here. And as I shared in prior videos, we have an example meeting agenda for the inputs and assumptions conversation that you can use as a starting point to have this discussion with your team. Okay, so you've completed your theory of change. Now, what do you do? The first thing I would do is actually take some time to celebrate. This is a big accomplishment. Not every nonprofit has a written theory of change that really articulates what you do and why. And it's going to set your organization apart. It's going to be a really valuable asset for you. So be sure to take time to celebrate first off. Then there are kind of three pathways that you can take to use your theory of change. The first is to use it as a communication tool. Use it to tell your story. Your theory of change kind of becomes a framework of being able to articulate what you do and why you do it. So you can share your theory of change visual and or narrative with anybody who's intimately involved with your organization, staff and volunteers for sure. Funders are almost always interested in this sort of thing. And even partners can be interested in seeing how you think about the change you're trying to make to understand your organization. So feel free to share your theory of change, use it to tell your story. Try and sit down with folks and use that visual as the basis of the conversation if that's possible. The second pathway is using your theory of change as a framework for making decisions. So you have an idea of how your activities lead to intended outcomes. So if you think about making a major change to any of your activities, like let's completely revamp this program, let's fund this area, let's defund this other area, you want to ask yourself, what impact might that have on our theory of change? How will that influence our ability to achieve the outcomes that are linked to that program? Hopefully, all of the decisions that we're making are at minimum not harming our theory of change, but ideally making our theory of change stronger and stronger over time. And then your third pathway here is to test your theory of change. So we have identified what is our intended impact in the world. Now let's actually test and see if we're making that impact. There are a few different aspects of this. One is just monitoring performance indicators, regular data points that you collect week in, week out, month in, month out. Another aspect is doing some kind of episodic evaluation. So these are more in-depth projects that examine particular aspects of your theory of change. And then the final piece is really a more qualitative exercise of just revisiting your theory of change once every 6 to 12 months. Your lived experience of doing this work will influence how you understand your theory of change and will allow you to grow your understanding over time. I guarantee if you revisit this thing in another year after you've defined it now, it will be stronger. You'll have more ideas for how this thing can actually work and how to make it even better in the future. So that's all I've got for you in terms of your theory of change. We've really walked through the entire process, all of the components. The next step is using that theory of change and translating it into those monitoring indicators, translating that into those episodic evaluations. And that's where the next tool comes in. So next we'll be talking about how to create your learning agenda. Thanks again.